was the genius leader of the Fang mercenaries, well, until my head was cut off and sent flying by the commander-in-chief, at least. Choosing to protect my comrades, I was used and then tossed aside. But now, destiny has given me a second chance. Waking up in the body of the useless third son of a noble, a boy who everybody thinks is trash, I can reach heights I could only dream of in my past life and gain riches and power to make those who humiliated this boy suffer and pay a bitter price. That and, of course, use the best of the money can offer to pleasure myself. But we have to get back to the start to understand how it all began. A man once said that a mercenary who does not die is third-rate. That was how things worked. The reason mercenaries were paid so well was not because of skill alone, but because they were willing to die for their masters without hesitation. Jake had heard that logic countless times, and the longer he lived, the more he realized just how true it was. Every single day, he listened to endless bullshit from employers, complaints, threats, unreasonable demands, and hollow promises, but there was nothing he could really do about it. That was simply the life of a mercenary. In the end, nobles were all the same. When they were desperate, they would promise land, swear loyalty, and make grand speeches, acting as if they would even grant titles if only their problem could be solved. Yet the moment their situation improved, they would change their tune as if on cue, spouting all kinds of creative crap and pretending none of it had ever been said. Jake voiced that thought aloud without holding back, his words dripping with scorn. Then, turning toward the man standing opposite him, he remarked that what he had just heard truly took the cake. It might have been the biggest piece of dog shit he had ever heard in his life. Surely, he must have misheard. The man facing him stood calmly, unmoved by the insult. He was the commander-in-chief. Jake called him that outright, and the commander confirmed that there had been no misunderstanding. Jake had heard correctly. He had just been ordered to die. Jake laughed. He asked whether the commander had forgotten who he was. The answer came immediately. No, he had not forgotten. Jake was the captain of the Fang mercenaries. Hearing his own name spoken so casually made Jake laugh even harder. For the commander to say something like that while fully aware of who he was, he never would have imagined the man had such a refined sense of humor. Otherwise, he would never have ordered a piece of trash mercenary to go fight and die with the supposed honor of a noble knight. The commander paused, thinking, and then admitted that perhaps he had gone too far. He apologized, saying that if he had given the wrong idea, that was his mistake. What he truly meant was that he wished to entrust Jake with a final mission. He explained that their repeated defeats had all but sealed their fate. Now, the blades of the rebels were pressed directly against the throat of the Crawford family, guardians of this land for generations. There was nowhere left to run. Realizing that had made him ramble, Jake responded that he understood completely. Given the situation, it looked like it was finally time for him to bail. If a man with the greatest talent in the empire could be cornered like this, then that alone said everything there was to say. It was a shame, too. The commander was actually a fairly decent noble, all things considered. Still, a final mission in the middle of this chaos, Jake could see right through it. The man must be trying to get him to secure a retreat path. He supposed he could count that as one last chore before collecting his final pay. The commander nodded and said the mission itself was simple. The rebels would launch an all-out offensive tomorrow. Jake was to stand with him and hold them back, even if only for a short while, until his lord could escape safely. Whether it was possible or not was irrelevant. All Jake needed to do was hold out until he died. To settle the balance, the commander produced a gem. It was enormous, valuable enough to cover 3 full years of operating costs for the entire Fang mercenaries corps. Jake slapped the gem out of his hand without hesitation. The sharp sound echoed in the room. The commander demanded to know what he was doing. Jake shot back that those were his words. Did the commander really take him for a fucking idiot just because he always smiled? The order he had just given was nothing more than telling his men to become meat shields. Even if they joined the fight, they would last only a moment. He intended to throw them away just to buy his master a few extra seconds to run. And even if, by some miracle, they did manage to hold out, then what? The rebels would never let them go. They would crucify them and make examples out of anyone they caught alive. The commander replied coldly that they were mercenaries, not knights. The enemy knew that as well. Once Jake was dead, they would not go out of their way to chase the rest down. Jake crossed his arms and scoffed. That was how things usually went in this line of work. But both of them knew the truth just as well as the other. To those rebels, the Fang mercenaries were sworn enemies, targets they wanted to tear limb from limb. Jake didn't need to imagine what would happen if things went wrong. He had seen it before, lived it, survived it by cutting faster than others. The rebels would not distinguish between knights and mercenaries when hatred was involved. To them, the Fang mercenaries were not hired blades but sworn enemies. They would not be satisfied until every last one of them was torn apart. That certainty dragged an old memory to the surface. Once when their base had been attacked, the enemy had advanced cautiously, scanning the surroundings. One of their scouts had spotted a soldier leaning weakly against a tree, coughing violently, his armor stained and broken. Thinking him a survivor, their commander ordered his men to check it out. The moment the man approached, a blade flashed upward and opened his throat. Blood sprayed before he even understood what had happened. Shouts erupted as the enemy soldiers recoiled in horror. For a split second, they thought it was betrayal from within their own ranks. Then realization hit. It was a trap, one laid carefully by the Fang mercenaries. Their commander, choking on blood, cursed them with his dying breath. He accused them of having no honor, of disguising themselves as dead soldiers. Jake had listened calmly, then stepped forward and cut off the man's head in a single swing. As it rolled across the dirt, he had acknowledged the truth without shame. They had no honor. They were not knights. They were mercenaries. That was how Jake had survived. He brought his thoughts back to the present and looked straight at the commander before him. He reminded him that he had cut down countless enemy commanders over the years. That was the only reason he had lived this long. And because of that, those rebel bastards were now desperate to tear the Fang mercenaries apart before they even reached their lord. Then realization dawned. Jake narrowed his eyes. The commander must have already taken all of that into account. That was why he intended to use them. He wanted the Fang mercenaries to draw the enemy's attention, to act as bait. The commander did not deny it. He simply said that he hoped Jake would carry out his mission. If he refused, then there would be no other choice. He would cut Jake down himself and assume command of the Fang mercenaries. As the commander's hand moved toward his sword, Jake reacted instantly, leaping backward and widening the distance between them. He let out a bitter laugh. He had thought this man was a little different from the other nobles. Turns out he was the biggest piece of shit of them all. The commander said he was sincerely sorry. Jake told him not to be. In fact, this worked out perfectly. Taking the head of a bastard like him and offering it to the rebels waiting outside would not leave a bad taste in his mouth at all. The commander frowned and asked if Jake planned to offer up his head to the rebels and beg for their lives. Jake admitted that he would love nothing more than to do exactly that, but he had already made preparations to keep them trapped here. In that case, as their captain, he had no choice. He would do everything within his power until the very end. He stated it plainly. Even those rebel bastards should be satisfied with 2 commander-level heads. That should be enough to let the rest of his men go free. The commander stared at him, stunned, and asked if he was truly offering his own head just to save his subordinates. Jake answered without hesitation. Of course he was. He had dragged them into this mess on his own selfish whim. He had promised them that they could achieve their dreams even if they started from the gutter. They trusted him enough to follow him here. Responsibility rested on his shoulders. At the end of the day, he was their captain, and that role mattered more to him than anything else. For the first time, the commander looked genuinely baffled. Then he began to laugh. This, he said, was what it meant to be a true leader. It was a shame. Instead of Crawford, he wished he had been Jake's lord from the very beginning. Jake was done talking. He lunged forward without another word, his killing intent fully unleashed. The commander let out a sharp shout, taken by surprise, and barely had time to ready himself. As their blades met, the commander told Jake never to forgive him. Jake answered honestly. He had known this would happen. What he hadn't expected was the sheer difference in strength between them. The gap was massive. Talon was fucking absurd. Still, it was fine. He had already ordered his men to run if he wasn't back on time, knowing that he could die in peace. He had always been prepared to go out like this. As his strength failed and his consciousness began to sink, one final thought crossed his mind. If he had been given the same opportunities as the commander, just how high could he truly have climbed? The world fell away, darkness swallowed him whole. Then, faintly, he heard a voice calling out to him. Someone was begging him to wake up. Jake opened his eyes. A boy was leaning over him, tears streaming down his face, desperately pleading for him to wake up. Jake asked who he was. Instead of answering, the boy raised his hand and slapped him hard across the face, shouting that he wanted him to wake up so badly. Jake grabbed his cheek in shock. He could feel it. He had really been hit. Before he could say anything else, the boy broke down crying again, begging him to pull himself together. But instead of calling him Jake, he called him Lucian. Something was terribly wrong. Jake lay there, staring up at the unfamiliar ceiling, while the boy continued crying over him. Something about the situation felt deeply wrong, and the unease only grew the longer he tried to process it. The boy's voice trembled as he spoke, saying that it was such a relief. He truly believed that his young master had passed away. If that had happened, his own heart would have stopped from the shock. And beyond that, as a personal servant, he would have been executed without question. Putting that aside, it would have been an unbearable tragedy for the family itself. Jake listened to the rambling in silence, trying to sort through the nonsense being thrown at him. Young master, personal servant, executed, family, none of it made sense. The most important problem was far more basic. He was certain that he had died. His head had been cut off cleanly in battle with the commander. There was no chance he could have survived that, and yet here he was, alive, conscious, and very much intact. He slowly raised a hand and touched his neck. His head was still attached. That alone was enough to tell him that this was no simple miracle or lucky survival. Calmly, he forced himself to think. If he panicked now, he would gain nothing. Judging by the circumstances, there was only one conclusion he could draw. He had entered the body of a complete stranger. As he pushed himself up, he caught sight of his reflection. The face staring back at him was not his own. It was young, clean, and shockingly handsome. Not a single scar marked its surface. His old body had been battered beyond recognition, carved up by years of battle until it looked like an old rag barely holding together. This one, in contrast, was pristine. A killer face card. Just by looking at it, he could tell. This body belonged to a noble. It practically radiated status. No commoner could ever possess something like this. The household behind it must reek of money. That realization made one thing clear. He needed information, and fast. He searched his memories, not his own, but the faint remnants left behind in this body. The boy's name surfaced. Hans, he called out to him and asked a simple question. What year was it? Hans blinked, clearly confused, and replied that his young master must still be groggy due to malignant energy. It was the imperial year 846. Jake froze. That date hit him like a hammer. It was 15 years before the day he had died. That meant only one thing: he hadn't just survived, he had returned to the past. How this had happened was a mystery, but he didn't dwell on it. If he reacted with shock to every strange thing from now on, there would be no end to it. First, he needed to focus on what had to be done. He turned his attention back to Hans and asked him coldly if he had a death wish. Hans flinched, confused by the sudden shift in tone. Jake demanded to know how a mere servant dared to touch his master's body without permission. Had the laws of this place changed while he was unconscious? Hans immediately bowed deeply, apologizing over and over. He admitted that he had been flustered earlier and committed a grave rudeness. Then, in a formal tone, he introduced his master properly. His noble name was Lucian Valdek. He was the third son of the great House Valdek. Jake's eyes widened. Valdek. If it was that Valdek, then he knew exactly who they were. House Valdek was one of the Empire's pillars, a historic and prestigious clan that had supported the Empire throughout its long history. They were positioned as the Emperor's closest aides, boasting power comparable to the imperial family itself. In other words, they were a true great house. Jake was intimately familiar with their circumstances. 15 years ago, he had worked in the Valdek territory as a guard for several years. When he died and opened his eyes again, he had briefly thought he had returned to that time. But now, reality hit him square in the face. He was the third son of the Valdek family. He let out a hollow laugh. It was absurd. Throughout his entire life, he had been forced to endure every humiliation imaginable simply because his status had been so damn low. And now, only now, fate had handed him the perfect opportunity. His final thought before death resurfaced in his mind. He had wondered how high he could have climbed if he had been given the same opportunities as others. Now it was as if fate itself wanted the answer too. If that was the wish it sought, then he would give it the perfect show. He stood, opened the door, and stepped forward, resolving to live as Lucian Valdek from that moment onward. Since he would be living under that name, he would use it properly. Looking around, he remarked that it truly was a grand duchy. He had traveled countless places in his life as a mercenary, but in terms of sheer splendor, this place surpassed them all. It was something he would have to get used to quickly. As he walked through the halls, he noticed something strange. The servants kept stealing glances at him, their expressions oddly cautious. He asked Hans if it was just his imagination. Hans replied that it was only natural. Lucien had entered seclusion and had not met a single person other than himself for over a year and 2 months. Jake sighed internally. What kind of nonsense was that? He wondered what the original Lucien had been thinking, locking himself away like that. The mindset of nobles was hard to understand. Still, something didn't add up. This was House Valdek, a place of firm principles and conviction. The giant who protected it, Grand Duke Sigmund, resided here. There was no way such a man would simply stand by and watch his own son rot away in a corner of his room. Either Lucien had been such a problem child that he was practically abandoned, or there were special circumstances that made Sigmund turn a blind eye. Until he understood what those circumstances truly were, he would avoid meeting his father as much as possible. Just as Lucien was forming that resolution, a calm, measured voice stopped him. A butler bowed politely and reported that it was true, he was awake. Seeing his face after an entire year filled him with joy. He then asked whether there was any discomfort in Lucien's movements. The moment Lucien heard that voice, recognition struck him. The Valdek family had this man as well. Edwin, the head butler. Lucien remembered him clearly. Edwin had entered the mansion as a hostage from a hostile family during his childhood, yet his outstanding ability had been recognized, and he had eventually taken charge of all family affairs. In practice, he was Grand Duke Sigmund's right hand. Of all people, Edwin was the one Lucien most wanted to avoid. There was no way a man like him wouldn't notice the sudden behavioral shift of someone who had come from the lowest rungs of society, even if he hadn't seen him for over a year. In that case, there was only one option. He would imitate the most noble-like person he knew. Lucien straightened his posture and responded with controlled politeness, thanking Edwin for his concern. He said that thanks to him, his condition had improved greatly. Taking this opportunity, he had decided to come out and inspect the family affairs he had neglected while studying indoors. Meeting the head butler right away meant luck was on his side, so he wondered if there had been any mishaps within the family. Edwin observed him closely before replying that the family was well, as always. Still, it was a relief that Lucien himself remained unchanged. Lucien laughed lightly and replied that with Edwin guarding the household, there was no way anything could have gone wrong. He added that he had worried for nothing and feeling tired from being out so long would return to rest. Just as he was about to leave, Edwin stopped him. He asked Lucien to wait a moment and urged him to delay his return. Right now, he was being summoned. Lucien immediately realized how bad that sounded. Before he could ask anything further, time moved on and he found himself standing before his father, Grand Duke Sigmund Valdek. Sigmund looked at him and said he would ask him one more time. His voice was calm, but there was something heavy beneath it. He asked Lucien why he was still alive. Lucien stared at him for a moment, taken aback, then asked what he meant by that. Sigmund said that he had intended to overlook many things. Lucien had used his mother's death as an excuse, forgotten his duties, and acted like a spoiled child. Even that, Sigmund had been willing to tolerate. But Lucien had crossed the line. Locking himself away for over a year was one thing, treating his own life lightly was another. Attempting to harm himself was unforgivable. Lucien's mind raced. What the hell was he talking about? Then realization dawned. That must have been why Hans had been making such a fuss earlier. Lucien tried to explain that there had been a misunderstanding, but Sigmund cut him off. For the last time, he demanded that Lucien spill out the thoughts he had kept hidden in that narrow mind of his. Sigmund said there had only been one purpose behind all of this from the beginning. Using his weak body and his own hands, Lucien had forced sleeping pills into his mouth to create a commotion. Sigmund wanted to know why. Lucien felt a chill run through him. He finally understood. Memories surfaced not from this body but from his own past. 15 years ago, when he had worked as a guard here, he remembered the third son of House Valdek dying. There had been a funeral. At the time, he hadn't given it much thought. Sigmund had 4 sons, all born of different mothers. During the 10 years Jake had worked here, he had encountered the young lords and their mothers many times. But Lucien and his mother, he had no memory of ever meeting them face to face. Lucien's mother had died of illness early on. Not long after Jake started working here, Lucien had followed her in death for reasons unknown. Back then, he had simply assumed they were sickly. Now he knew better. Lucien's mother's death and his unstable position within the family must have been too much for a child to bear. In desperation, he had taken sleeping pills, just short of a lethal dose, hoping to gain even a fragment of his father's attention. But during the long seclusion that followed, his weakened body failed him. Unable to withstand the drugs, he died quietly in that room. That was the moment Lucien Valdec truly died, and Jake took his place. Lucien understood now why Sigmund's anger ran so deep. To a father who hadn't seen his son in over a year, such behavior demanded answers. Whether Sigmund was sentimental or not, he was still the father of this body, and his thoughts must have been in turmoil. But Lucien didn't have the luxury of sympathy. This was a final ultimatum. He could hear it, the sound of cracks forming in the golden future he had barely obtained. One wrong word here and it would all shatter. At best, he would be exiled to a remote monastery as a priest, cut off from the secular world forever. At worst, he would be sent to the harsh northern territories, condemned to a lifetime of cold, snowfields, and beasts. A completely shitty life. He refused to accept that. This was a life he had earned after getting his head cut off. It was precious. The future ahead of him was grand, and he would not allow someone else's family issues to destroy it. Taking a steady breath, Lucien began to speak. Lucien lowered his head and spoke carefully, aware that every word carried weight. He began by acknowledging his foolishness. By disgracing the family name and causing his father such concern, he admitted that there was nothing he could say in his defense. The fault was entirely his. There was no room for excuses, and he would accept whatever punishment was handed down to him. Sigmund replied that such words would not change what had already happened. Lucien raised his head then and continued. Precisely because it could not be changed, he said, it should now be possible for his father to rejoice freely. The words came out calmly, but they carried an unexpected sharpness. For the first time, Sigmund looked genuinely surprised. Lucien acknowledged that what had happened was already in the past. Trying to salvage it would be meaningless. Instead, he would live diligently for the future that lay ahead. And not as the Grand Duke, but as a father, Sigmund should offer a single word of encouragement to a child who had erred and now repented before his parent. A parent, bound by the laws of heaven, should embrace such a child. That, Lucien said, was the proper duty between father and son. The room fell silent. Edwin, standing to the side, could not hide his surprise. He murmured that he had felt Lucien's atmosphere change, but hearing words like these from him made it difficult to believe this was the same Lucien who had always cowered before authority. An awkward stillness stretched on until Sigmund finally spoke again. He demanded to know how Lucien dared to raise his voice in front of him and lecture him on the duties of a parent. Then, unexpectedly, Sigmund smiled. He said he had lived long enough to see everything. Lucien bowed deeply, smiling as well. Inside, relief washed over him. That shit had actually worked. Instead of running away and tiptoeing like a rat walking on eggshells, ramming straight into the problem had been the answer. Sigmund valued the spirit of a son who knew how to fight back. That was what he wanted to see. Sigmund remarked that Lucien seemed to have grown quite brazen after coming back from the dead. Since he had spoken of diligence himself, Sigmund asked him what he intended to do from now on. Lucien answered without hesitation. First, he would fix his broken body. After that, remembering the overwhelming gap in swordsmanship that had led to his death at the commander's hands, he intended to learn the sword properly. Sigmund looked genuinely surprised. Lucien added that his body came first. If he ate and slept diligently, it would likely work out somehow. Sigmund stared at him as if he could not quite believe what he was hearing, but in the end, he decided to accept it. He said Lucien had a way with words, but whether this was bluff or sincerity would become clear with time. He then turned to Edwin and told him to give Lucien that again. Lucien had no idea what that meant. Edwin responded that he would process it immediately so it would be available without delay. Lucien remained confused but said nothing. Later, outside Lucien's estate, carriages arrived one after another, unloading chests directly into his living quarters. When Lucien opened one of them, he found nothing but gold. He stared at it for a long moment, then let out a low laugh. This was what it meant to be a high noble. The allowance was enormous, and this was only for a single month. For the first time, he felt that this new life might actually be worth something. With these resources, he could completely overhaul this weak body. He could even recreate elixirs he remembered from the future. Sometime later, Sigmund stood alone in the garden. Edwin joined him and noted that this was a place the late Grand Duchess had cherished deeply during her life. Sigmund had not visited it in a long time, so Edwin surmised that Lucien's change must have drawn him here. Even though Lucian had fallen out of favor for a time, he was still the child of the Grand Duchess Sigmund had loved so dearly. There was no way he would let him go so easily. Sigmund spoke quietly, saying that Lucian had once been truly pathetic. He had always rolled his eyes around as if frightened, whining like a wild dog if Sigmund raised his voice even slightly. For a long time, Sigmund had believed that the only resemblance Lucian shared with his mother was her appearance. But today, for the first time, that thought wavered. Lucian had looked him straight in the eyes and stated his opinion. Edwin confirmed that he had seen it as well. Lucian's demeanor had been confident yet thoughtful. He had a tender heart and likely hesitated more than the other young masters. But that was only natural. After all, Sigmund's blood flowed through him. Sigmund replied that it remained to be seen. The tasks ahead of Lucian were not things that could be resolved with mere words. Edwin then reported a problem. Support funds that had previously been stopped for Lucian had been resumed, but it had been confirmed that some of them were leaking outside. Upon investigation, it appeared the second young master, Jord, was involved. Furthermore, he had dismissed the head maid assisting Lucian and replaced her with one of his own associates, making his intent to keep Lucian in check obvious. Sigmund said Jord was a capable child, but his vessel was narrow. He understood Jord's resentment toward the third son due to issues with his maternal family, but he had not expected such persistence. When Edwin asked if countermeasures were necessary, Sigmund shook his head. He did not intend to intervene. Edwin protested that it would be too harsh on someone who had only just begun to take his first steps again. Sigmund replied that such petty tricks would not have worked at all if Lucian had managed his surroundings properly. If this was the price Lucian paid for failing to come to his senses over the past year, then so be it. This would show how he handled things now. If he could not handle it, there would be no reason to hold expectations. Even if the blood of House Valdek was the key, opening the door had to be done by one's own hands. A few days later, whispers spread among the maids. Lucian Valdek had locked himself in his room once again. Hands looked visibly anxious. It had already been 3 days since the support funds started coming in again. He explained that Lucian had told him the funds were resumed because he spoke with his father and that the conversation had gone well. But considering the relationship between the two of them, Hans could only imagine how difficult that meeting must have been. The courage it took was unimaginable. As he spoke, he noticed Lucian's body trembling and assumed it was fear, that he was forcing himself to move forward while turning his back on the sadness he had carried for so long. In reality, Lucian wasn't shaking out of fear at all. He was shaking because he was a greedy bastard. Back in his room, the air was thick with the scent of herbs. Countless aromas mingled together, sharp and bitter, filling every corner. Lucian wiped the sweat from his brow and remarked that Hans must be burning with curiosity. Still, the fact that Hans guarded the door exactly as ordered meant he was loyal enough. That alone was worth acknowledging. Spread across the room were brewing tools that the son of a Grand Duke would never have touched in his life. Alongside them lay an herb so filthy expensive that most people wouldn't even dare look at it too closely. Moonlight herb. A plant that only grew under moonlight, whose common usage had not yet been established. Lucian had spent his entire allowance on it. Even so, it wasn't too late. He could continue buying as much as possible. Right now, he probably looked like a crazy person. But in just 1 year, the price would skyrocket to more than 20 times its current value. At that point, profits would roll in mindlessly. He had to hand it to the Alchemist Guild for their sheer boldness. At the time, the success of their gamble had been far from certain, yet they scraped together every moonlight herb they could find across the empire. It truly was the gamble of a lifetime. But that gamble secured the guild's fate, and thanks to that boldness, they created an unprecedented elixir, one that would later shake the entire empire. Nectar, the drink of the gods. Due to the arrogance of invoking the name of God for a mere drug, they had even faced the danger of blasphemy charges. Yet once its efficacy became known, everyone conveniently forgot about that and began praising it endlessly. Lucian smiled. There was a proposition that had never been denied for over 1,000 years. A martial artist's realm was determined at birth. Talent was fixed. Constitution never changed. It was an absolute law of nature that no one could defy. Nectar shattered that common sense into pieces. With a single drink, even someone with zero talent could be transformed into a usable swordsman. Of course, what Lucian had made fell far short of the original's true efficacy. It was nothing more than a mass-produced variant. Still, for raising a broken body to this extent, there was nothing better at the moment. In that sense, Lucian was lucky. Later, when a chaotic era engulfed the Empire, the first thing to burn was the Alchemist Guild. The nectar recipe, which had overturned the balance of power itself, was simply too dangerous. Because of that, it vanished from the world entirely. However, Lucian had gathered enough clues to recreate something similar. Most people who tried experimenting like this had died from side effects. But that was enough yapping. Now was the important part. As he began chugging the potion, Lucian focused on the transformation. Nectar's power depended heavily on how well mana circulated throughout the body, how efficiently it spread and was retrieved. The quality and output varied drastically from person to person. At the moment, Lucian was borrowing Nectar's power to forcibly widen the blocked paths within his body, but something was wrong. There was no resistance, no pain. None of the backlash that should have accompanied the acceptance of mana. Instead, it flowed freely, unhindered, as if it had finally found its rightful place. Even newborn babies typically had impurities blocking circulation. Which meant only one thing. From the very beginning, Lucian's body hadn't been defective at all. It was the body of a genius. Lucian had thought he was a small fish swimming in the ocean. In reality, he was far closer to a whale. By the time the sun began to set, Hans was pacing the hallway anxiously, glancing out the window again and again. When he heard the door finally open, he rushed over in tears. He said he had no idea how long Lucian had been inside. He hadn't answered when called, and because he had been told never to enter no matter what, Hans feared something terrible had happened. Lucian looked down at him calmly. Hans stared back, shaken. It was definitely Lucian. And yet it didn't feel like him at the same time. Lucian sighed. Of course Hans noticed. He had been watching him closer than anyone else. Physically, there were no major changes yet. His body still needed time and proper nutrition. But internally, everything was changing at an unbelievable speed. His innate constitution made it possible. Now Lucian was certain. His potential was on the same level as the legends who would later change the world. If he played his cards right, he could surpass even his mercenary era prime within a single year. He told Hans that he owed this opportunity to him. Hans asked what he meant. Lucian replied that rewards and punishments must always be clear. He would only say this once. Hans needed to scrape together everything he owned, even sell his underwear if he had to, and go all in. Lucian guaranteed him a smooth ride to the top. They would reach the skies together. Hans cringed. Lucian laughed, saying he was jealous. Back in his day, they didn't have nobles like this. Hans could only wonder what the hell was wrong with him. A week later, Lucian found himself walking through the forest within the estate. His steps were light, almost carefree, and he even found himself whistling. The air felt refreshing. He hadn't expected life to become this easy. Meals were served like clockwork. His room was cleaned without him lifting a finger. His bedding was prepared for him every night. Things that would have once felt absurd now came naturally. Hans, who used to starve as part of his daily routine, no longer felt hunger at all. Thanks to that, Lucian was able to focus fully on his recovery. And with his body stabilizing, he could finally address the one thing that had been weighing on his mind. Jake, at this point in time, Jake existed as a guard who once served the Valdec family. Lucian had quietly confirmed with the captains that no one matching that description had ever replied to duty reports. The shift Jake used to work had already been filled by a complete stranger. That was for the best. There was no benefit in meeting him, it would only become a distraction. And more than that, Lucian didn't even have the confidence to face his past self. He would probably die of embarrassment before managing to say a single word. Hans noticed Lucian slowing down and called out to him. When Lucian turned, Hans asked hesitantly if he was really planning to go in there. Lucian followed his gaze, the training grounds. Hans reminded him that he wouldn't even set foot near that place before. He had hated it. Lucian asked if that was really true. Hans nodded immediately. Ever since the second young master had given him a hard time during training, Lucian had sworn never to return. Judging by Hans's reaction, Lucian could already piece together what had happened. Swordsmanship was a required skill for the children of a Grand Duke. Under the guise of training, it must have been the perfect opportunity for the second young master to instill fear into a young Lucian. A flawless method to ensure he would never enter the training hall again. Lucian told Hans not to worry, that was all in the past. Hands didn't believe him at first, but Lucien told him simply to trust his words and follow his lead. Together, they stepped into the training hall. Inside, several people were chatting casually. One of them asked in disbelief if it was really true that the third young master had come here on his own 2 feet. Another confirmed it, saying that he was currently looking around the hall with his personal servant. Someone muttered that there was no way he could have forgotten what happened that day. Still, this might be for the best. He decided he should report it immediately, making sure the second young master would have him cooked nicely by the time he arrived. Lucien, meanwhile, took in his surroundings with open amazement. He had high hopes, but the reality blew them away. The sheer number of weapons alone meant he would never have to worry about breakage. The massive space allowed even the most intense movements without restriction. To think a single individual owned a facility like this, it was insane. If he had a place like this back when he was leading his mercenary group, maybe more of his men would have survived. A man with a mustache from earlier muttered that he hadn't been mistaken after all. The third young master really had come. He vividly remembered how Lucien had run last time during his lesson with Yurid, like a lamb being chased by a wolf. That had to be why he still seemed terrified of this place. Dragging a servant into the sacred hall of warriors only proved he was still out of his mind. The man stepped forward and introduced himself as Atrick, offering his humble greetings. A year ago, he had personally instructed Lucien on his stance alongside the second young master. He asked if Lucien recalled it, calling it an enjoyable time. Lucien smiled. This was going to be fun. He had found his first punching bag. Lucien reflected briefly on what a knight truly was, an incarnation of honor and loyalty, usually born of noble blood. From a young age, they were taught both martial arts and etiquette. Only after proving themselves on the battlefield or through missions would they receive the title of knight from their liege. In the end, though, they were little more than hunting dogs wearing expensive collars. That was why they were obligated to show courtesy to the liege who provided them with wealth and honor, and to his bloodline as well. Yet here stood a knight with an arrogant attitude that bordered on insolence. Lucien's low standing in the family likely played a role, but the biggest factor was obvious. This man was relying on his backer to act out. If it were up to Lucien, he would have started by reforging the man's mind through brutal training, strapping him to a wheel and throwing knives until fear was carved out of him. But his father would never allow that. Knights were core military assets. Punishing them without formal procedure would only create friction. It wasn't time yet. Lucien spoke calmly, saying that avoiding the training hall because of past incidents was foolish. He intended to stop by often from now on. He wanted to learn sword forms, and since a year had passed, he would need to catch up. Atrick laughed. He asked if Lucien was really talking about sword forms. Joking was one thing, but it was far too late for that now. Lucien asked what he meant. Atrick explained smugly. Anyone past the age of 15 was finished. Sword forms were secret techniques passed down from their ancestors, evolving the physical body through enlightenment. But all of that required open mana paths. Since mana paths supposedly began closing at 16, learning sword forms now would be meaningless, nothing more than empty movements, a hollow dance. In fact, it would suit Lucien perfectly. He could become the Empire's #1 dancer, or perhaps take up gardening. Everyone had a role that suited them best. Atrick smiled to himself. Lucien was unable to say a word back. In truth, the claim about mana paths closing at 16 was complete nonsense, something that could be disproven with minimal research. But it didn't matter. The objective had already been achieved. A fool crushed by ignorance, unable to respond, was no better than a worm. And yet, Lucien did not move. Lucien tilted his head slightly, as if something about the explanation didn't sit right with him. After a brief pause, he said that for some reason, what Atrick was saying felt different from what he knew. From his understanding, the path of mana didn't close at 16. It closed closer to the age of 25. If that was the case, then there shouldn't be any issue with learning sword forms now. The training hall fell quiet. Atrick frowned and asked if Lucien was certain about those words. Lucien nodded calmly and added that perhaps he himself was mistaken. In that case, did his brother share the same view? Atrick answered without hesitation that of course he did. It was obvious common sense. Lucien's expression shifted. Then this truly ended it. Since Atrick had invoked his brother's authority, there was no reason to argue further. If the second young master truly believed something so blatantly incorrect, then the situation was far more serious than Lucien had thought. It meant the family itself was in danger. Lucien grabbed Hans by the head and turned him slightly, asking if he thought the same. Hans yelped in confusion, demanding to know why he was being dragged into this. Lucien clicked his tongue and said it was unbelievable. To think someone at that age could be confused about knowledge that even a street mutt understood. How many talents had been robbed of opportunity because of that dog shit misinformation. And to think his own brother possessed such a smooth, empty brain, it was astonishing. Atrick finally snapped, demanding to know what Lucien thought he was saying. Lucien raised a hand and told him not to interrupt. If what the knight claimed was true, then this was no longer a personal insult. It was a disgrace to the family. A full-blown crisis. But surely, he added calmly, Atrick wasn't trying to deceive the son of his liege. That single sentence wiped the color from Atrick's face. For a moment, he couldn't say a word, then he demanded to know what Lucien meant by accusing him of deception. Lucien waved it off, saying he must have misspoken. He simply couldn't believe the situation. There was no way a knight of House Valdek would resort to something so petty. Atrick swallowed hard and stammered that of course not. Lucien smiled. He said he knew it. But even so, this wasn't something they could overlook. Opening one's mouth without understanding the consequences came at a price. Lucien turned to Atrick and asked if he still didn't grasp how serious this matter was. Atrick hesitated, asking what exactly Lucien meant. Lucien explained it clearly. If Atrick had merely intended to humiliate him, Lucien would have let it go. After all, the reason others didn't look kindly upon him was his own fault. He had neglected his duties and wasted time in vain. How could he blame others for that? But this was different. If a knight and his brother, a pillar of the Grand Duchy, were actively hindering the recruitment of talent by spreading incorrect knowledge, that was not something he could ignore. It would create cracks in the military strength of the knights. Strictly speaking, it was a grave threat to the safety of the territory's people. As someone who bore the name Valdek, it was only right for him to be outraged. Lucien felt it click perfectly into place. He was absolutely nailing this shit. He told Atrick that surely he understood the gravity of the issue now. He should prepare himself. Lucien intended to report this to their father and formally request an internal crackdown. Atrick panicked. That wasn't possible. The Lucien he knew trembled just from hearing his brother's name. Why was he blowing this up so far? Then it hit him. He had made a mistake. He had always believed Lucien was frail, like a lamb, but standing before him now was something far closer to a wolf. At that moment, another voice entered the training hall, asking what all the commotion was about. Atrick turned, relief washing over him. It was Yorid. Lucien noted silently that the timing couldn't have been better. Yorid demanded to know what Lucien was doing there. Atrick rushed toward him, desperate to explain everything, but Yorid cut him off, saying he didn't need to hear it. He had already seen enough. To be swayed by a child barely half his age was disgraceful. He ordered Atrick to fix his expression unless he wanted to make things even worse for himself. Yorid continued forward, and Hans whispered anxiously, asking what they should do. Yorid looked furious. Lucien observed him closely. This was Yorid Valdek, a noble among nobles, famous for having a dog-shit personality. Even back when Lucien served as a guard, he had known that much. His influence was weaker than the firstborns, so he gathered outsiders around him. Most of them met terrible ends. Once Yorid deemed them useless, he framed them for crimes and cut them loose. Lucien greeted him politely, remarking that it had been a long time and asking if he had been well. Yorid scoffed and called him foolish. Lucien asked what he meant. Yorid said he had watched the entire exchange. Lucien had dared to act in a way that tarnished the dignity of House Valdek. Lucien asked him to clarify. Did he mean the family's dignity or Yorid's personal dignity? Yorid replied coldly. Hendrik hadn't studied theory in a long time, which led to a misunderstanding. Using his name to stir up confusion was a clear mistake, and Lucien wouldn't escape responsibility for it. However, Yorid added that he had no intention of rebuking Lucien for this incident. Unlike Lucien, he understood the weight of loyalty and how much blood had been shed for the Valdek family. There was no way someone who had fled from basic training had the right to criticize him. Lucien needed to learn respect for their knights because it was thanks to them that House Valdek existed at all. Yorid then apologized to everyone present on behalf of his brother, calling it the mistake of an immature child. He asked them to show leniency and promised to personally take responsibility for his foolish younger brother. Lucien listened carefully. So that was how Yorid intended to play it. He had been the one insulting Lucien, yet he twisted it into an argument about knights and dignity, neatly preserving his own image. Lucien had to give him credit for that. He expected nothing less from his brother. Lucien responded politely. He said there had indeed been a misunderstanding between Atrick and himself. Atrick should have rightfully scolded him for daring to insult him. Instead, Yorid had granted him such valuable teachings. As for the remark about his brother's empty head, that was something he felt ashamed of. He never should have spoken such embarrassing words. Yorid's expression darkened. Lucien continued, saying that once again he had learned from his brother's benevolence. He turned to Hans and instructed him to record Yorid's teachings immediately and to use the finest silk. Lucien knew this was his chance. He needed to erase the weak image of the past and engrave into everyone's mind that the Lucien they once knew no longer existed. He stepped closer to Yorid and asked politely if he might take his leave. Dragging this out would benefit no one. Yorid sneered, asking if Lucien truly believed he could leave just like that. Lucien reminded him calmly that their father had been keeping an eye on him lately. Lucien had nothing to lose. Yorid, on the other hand, had everything to lose. He took Yorid's silence as agreement and turned to leave. Under his breath, he told Hans that they needed to haul ass. Behind them, Atrick watched nervously, wondering if it was really okay to let him go. Yorid stood frozen, killing intent leaking from him. Outside the training hall, Hans kept glancing back over his shoulder, unable to calm himself. He asked in a strained voice whether they would really be all right. He knew Yorid's personality better than anyone. That kind of man would never let something like this slide. Even if they somehow escaped trouble today, Hans was certain that the mustached knight would make Lucien vanish without a trace the moment an opportunity presented itself. Lucien told him he understood. Only those who had experienced it themselves could truly grasp the feeling when an incompetent superior caused trouble and then pretended ignorance, leaving the subordinates to suffer for it. It left a bitter taste that never went away, but Lucien wouldn't let that happen. He told Hans to straighten up. A mere knight wouldn't dare commit such an act, and even if one tried, Lucien would not allow it. He had already suffered enough because of that man, and when a master acted like an idiot, it was always the subordinates who paid the price. Especially Hans, who served as his personal attendant. It must have been even worse for him. Lucien promised him one thing. From now on, he would never allow his people to be ignored or to tremble in fear because of his own foolishness. They would do their best together. Sometime later, back at the estate, Lucien found it strange how quiet things had become after the incident at the training hall. The Yorid he knew was not the type to sit back and take humiliation quietly. As he crumpled a piece of paper in his hand, he realized this was the trick Yorid had been preparing. He had been waiting for this exact moment. Hans said they couldn't just let this slide. Lucien asked him if he was ready. Hans answered without hesitation that he was. Lucien then asked how Yorid dared to touch his allowance. Hans replied bitterly that that shit had been his salary. It had started with the budget plan delivered that day. It was the very day Lucien intended to buy additional moonlight herb and stock up on necessary supplies. His account should have been replenished. That was how it was supposed to work. But when Lucien opened the letter, his smile vanished. Confusion took its place and he dropped the paper in shock. His allowance and Hans's salary had been gutted. Lucien couldn't believe that bastard had laid hands on his funds through the head maid Yorid had planted in his annex. Embezzlement was a felony punishable by severe execution, even among nobles. The only reason Yorid could pull off something like this was because Lucien had left a gap in his defenses. After his mother's death, Lucien had entrusted budget management to someone else. The former head maid, Dana, had stayed by his side for a long time, but now she was gone, replaced by a new head maid, one who was obviously part of Yorid's faction. That woman soon appeared. She greeted Lucien politely, saying it was her first time meeting him face to face and that she was pleased to finally do so. She introduced herself as Jenny, the new head maid appointed to replace Miss Dana. She mentioned that she had wanted to greet him earlier, but since he hadn't left his room, she assumed his long isolation had only just ended. Hans bristled and demanded to know what kind of tone she thought was appropriate when addressing the young master. Lucien stopped him and told him to calm down. She wasn't wrong, but small talk could wait. There were more important matters to discuss. Lucien asked her directly whether she had drafted the budget plan. Jenny laughed lightly, saying she had wondered why she was called in. Yes, she had written it. Since the young master had entrusted full authority to the former head maid, she had simply carried out her duties. Still, she admitted she was perplexed to be interrogated like this after working so diligently. After all, this was originally work Lucien should have been doing himself. Lucien acknowledged that she would use that excuse. He knew full well that his own negligence had allowed this situation to arise. That much couldn't be helped. However, something still didn't add up. He had confirmed that most of the funds reissued by his father were allocated toward raising servant salaries. Considering how much they had suffered due to his neglect, one could even see that as compensation. So why had Hans's salary been cut instead of raised? The answer was far too blatant. Jenny smiled again and said it must have been a mistake. Managing a household was complicated. There were countless details to worry about, and everyone there could testify to how overworked she was. She turned to the surrounding servants and asked them to back her up. They did. Out of fear, they agreed readily, promising to assist her even better from now on. Lucien sighed. He told Hans they should return. Hans asked why. Lucien answered calmly. The body might belong to him, but the hands and feet were listening to someone else. As they reached the door, Lucien stopped and turned back to Jenny. He said he had one last question and asked her to answer carefully. He wanted to know whether she understood who her true master was. Jenny replied that regarding that matter she would go and ask Yorid. Lucien nodded. He said that when tissue became festered, it had to be cut out for the body to live. Right now, the heart was rotting. They left the estate and headed toward an inn. Hans remarked that he had thought they were going fishing to calm their minds, but the place they entered was notorious for illegal fights. Lucien asked him whether he felt it. This was the perfect place to catch a big fish. Lucien approached the barkeep, who sneered and told him this wasn't a place for kids like him to snoop around. He ordered him to get lost while he was still being nice. Lucien placed a sack of money on the table. He asked calmly why a gambling den was so picky and whether the man simply didn't want new customers. And that is where we leave off for today. If you want to know what happens next, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next part.